Welcome to the Billboard Mastery Podcast, where you will learn the correct way to identify, evaluate, negotiate, perform due diligence on, select the construction type, build, rent the ad space, and operate billboard signs. And now, here is your host, the guy that built from scratch the largest privately owned billboard company in Dallas-Fort Worth, Frank Rolfe.
The COVID-19 pandemic has changed a lot of things in America, and one thing that's changed a lot is the patterns of the population and where it's going. And right now, the way it's going, it's moving from urban markets to suburban and exurban markets, and that's putting a lot of power back into rural road billboards. This is Frank Rolfe with the Billboard Mastery Podcast. We're talking about how to make money with those good old-fashioned wooden telephone pole signs out there along rural roads outside the big city limits. Now, that's where most of the advertising world came from in the world of signs, because at one time in American history, there really weren't any urban markets. It was kind of all rural, kind of all agricultural back in the 1920s and 1930s. So as a result, most people cut their teeth and got into the billboard business out in those more remote areas. All the big companies today all had their start from those old wooden telephone pole signs. So how can you get your start there? How can you take advantage of this new shift in America of people moving out of urban cores out into suburban and exurban markets? Well, first thing you have to do is you have to identify what the roads are in question. We all know the interstate highway system, and of course, there's always opportunities on the interstate highway system outside the city limits. But if you look, there's also these state roads, and some of these state roads carry pretty good traffic. So a good starting spot would be to get your highway traffic map from your state highway department. This will show you all of the roads that are large enough to be studied by the state and what the traffic counts are. You'll find some of these rural roads are doing 24-hour traffic counts of 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 vehicles a day. That's a pretty good amount of traffic. So first thing you have to do is identify what those roads are. Number two, you have to learn what the laws are on your state regarding rural areas. In cities, billboards typically have to be built on commercially zoned tracks. In rural areas, there's a whole nother set of rules. You have to have what's called an unzoned commercial. Unzoned commercial can be two businesses side by side in some states. It can be just one business in some state. But you need to find out what those rules are. Now, you'll find rural roads can go through not only unzoned areas, but also they can also cross into cities that do have zoning. So you'll want to study that road and where that road goes and how far out the traffic goes it's worthwhile, and create some targets there. Now, obviously, if you're going to succeed in the world of billboards, it's all about selling ad space, and there need to be advertisers as well. Normally, fortunately, there's a correlation between traffic and advertisers. Where there's lots of people going down the road, you'll have lots of different people selling goods and services to all those consumers. But you want to get a good handle on where those sources of advertising are. Let me give you examples of all those signs I built out in East Texas. So what happened was you have Dallas, then you have the loop around Dallas, and there's LBJ Freeway. And then beyond that, you have what are definitely suburbs and what are called exurbs. That's the next ring of cities beyond the suburb. And there were many roads leading out of Dallas into these areas. Some were interstate highways, some just regular state highways. But in all cases, you could see very clearly patterns of where you would want to be. So what I did was I focused on all those small towns out there. Places like Forney and Kaufman. I knew all the towns, and I studied who all the advertisers were and exactly what was going on. And so I knew there would be demand if I could just get signs out that way. So I learned what the Texas laws were as far as billboards go. And then I sought out those roads with sufficient traffic. And then I went out there and started looking for locations. Now you'll find it's a lot less competitive when you get out into those rural areas. You'll go around and say, oh, there's a sign location there. Oh, there's another one there. Gee, I wonder why they haven't built them. Well, that's because out in the rural areas, since there are more available locations, you have to be a lot smarter about what you build. You're going to want to build locations that have great visibility. Curve in the road is awesome when you have what's called a head-on curve in the road exposure. That's great stuff. You wouldn't want to build a billboard that's blocked by a bunch of trees or a bridge overpass. So you'll need to be more selective in your location from that regard. And also, you've got to find landowners who are willing to allow you to build a sign. Many farmers often won't let you build a sign because they frankly don't want to bother with it regarding their cattle or moving their tractor around when they plant their corn or whatever the case may be. So you want to have a very good number of targets. And then what you do is once you jump into that market, once you build that first sign and you go out to all the advertisers, you'll start getting comments and questions from the advertisers saying things like, hey, you know what? I don't really need that sign, but I take a sign on this road coming into town. Or they'll say, yeah, I'll take that sign, but I want another sign coming from the other side of town going towards me. Can you get me a sign there? I've had a lot of the signs I was building out in the rural areas were things that were by request, kind of like some musician who says, is there another request from the audience here? People would tell me, I'd have some advertisers who tell me, yeah, I like that sign, but I want one on each road coming into town. Can you do that? Now, of course, the problem is I'd have to rent the ad space going the other way too. So sometimes I would say, well, I'd love to build you that sign, but I can't find anyone to rent the other side going out of town. In other cases, I would build just a one-sided sign if I could find the right opportunity with someone. The bottom line is it's very much of a different market when you do billboards out in those smaller towns, in those smaller suburbs and exurbs. Suddenly, all of the issues you have in urban markets of finding locations that can be tough, finding advertiser are kind of aloof, all of that becomes very much broken down and life becomes a whole lot simpler. Another part that's a lot simpler is just the kind of sign that you build. Out in rural areas, you're typically building a sign made of wood. It's the most inexpensive type of sign. Wooden telephone poles, 2x4 stringers, and plywood faces. So the capital commitment to get into the sign business in the rural areas is far, far lower than it is in the city, which is typically a big steel monopole or something similar. And I mean by a lot. It might be 10 or 20 times more per sign to build that big metal sign in the city boundary than it is to build that sign out in that smaller rural area. And that's again very attractive because the rates of return, therefore, are much higher in the rural signs. Some people who could build signs in the city, they elect just to do the rural anyway because they like the fact it's a lower price point going in and it just seems a lot more secure. Remember that those rural signs don't rent for huge amounts of money, typically $200, $300 a month. Signs in the city might go for 10 times that. But when you're only talking $200 to $300 a month, there's a whole lot more advertisers who can afford that and who want that kind of advertising opportunity. So it makes renting the ads so much easier, so much more consistent, much greater renewal rates, much better retention rates. It just makes life a whole lot happier and easier. In fact, that's what a lot of rural America is all about, is the fact it's lower stress. And the same is true with billboards. Sometimes doing billboards in those smaller markets can be a whole lot lower stress on you, the billboard owner, because it doesn't cost you as much. You don't feel like you have as much risk when you build them. And they rent so much more consistently. You can see people on rural signs who've been on that sign for 10 or 20 straight years, never coming off. They feel there's a very good balance between what they pay and what they get. As a result, they have no desire to ever leave that sign. You rarely see that in the big city. Normally 1 year commitment, maybe a couple years if you're lucky, but then they move on to some other form of advertising. In those rural markets, they can go really long periods of time. Also, there's just so many more rural areas in America than cities. Look at your map. Look at that footprint of America, all 50 states. Look how tiny that little landmass is of those big cities compared to that big old state. So when you have rural in your blood, looking for rural signs, you're going to find that there's a whole lot more of those rural markets out there than there ever were of the urban. That always gives you also greater confidence. There's more opportunities for you to find the right sign to build and to scale up your billboard company into something larger that meets whatever the scale is that you need of income. Certainly nothing wrong with rural. Don't let people try and put you down when you do small town signs. There's a lot of guys out there who do small town signs that make a lot more money than those who do it in the big city. The bottom line to it all is we're in the middle of a mega trend right now in America. A whole lot of people coming out of COVID have now realized they don't like living in the city that much. They like the physical separation of being in the smaller town. They like the ability to perhaps make friends and find more inexpensive things and not go to restaurants and not go to clubs, not do those kinds of behaviors. A lot of people are finding they like the suburban, exurban markets more as far as raising a family. They like the urban market when they were young and single, but now no longer works for them. Whatever the case may be, is we're seeing a huge migration right now in America from people leaving the big cities, moving into suburbs, into exurbs, and that's putting all kind of pressure and opportunity on new things you can do with billboards using some very time-proven traditional methods. This is Frank Roth with the Billboard Mastery podcast. Hope you enjoyed this. Talk to you again soon.
Thank you for listening to the Billboard Mastery podcast. Be sure to visit us at www.billboardmastery.com, where you can find past episodes of this show, plus an array of information to help you successfully build, buy, and operate billboard signs.